Albert Einstein. The name alone conjures images of wild hair, revolutionary equations, and a mind that literally changed how we understand the universe. E equals mc, the theory of relativity. The Nobel Prize winner who became the face of genius itself. But behind the legendary physicist was a father of 3 children whose stories are far more dramatic than any scientific discovery. One disappeared without a trace. Another battled severe mental illness in a world that didn't understand it. And the third carried the weight of his father's legacy while struggling to find his own identity. Today, we're diving into the untold stories of Lieserl, Hans Albert, and Edward Einstein, 3 lives shaped by having the world's most famous genius as their father. Their stories involve family secrets, mental illness, scientific ambition, and tragedy that Einstein himself tried desperately to hide from the world. If you love discovering the hidden stories behind history's greatest figures, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more fascinating deep dives into the past. Lieserl, Einstein. The story begins with Einstein's greatest secret, a daughter the world didn't know existed for nearly a century. In 1901, 22-year-old Albert Einstein was a struggling patent clerk in Switzerland, deeply in love with his fellow physics student, Mileva Merrick. She was brilliant, ambitious, and one of the few women studying physics at the time, but their love affair would produce a scandal that could have destroyed Einstein's career before it even began. In 1902, while Einstein was in Switzerland and Mileva was visiting her parents in Serbia, she gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Lieserl. But here's the shocking part. Einstein and Mileva weren't married yet, and having a child out of wedlock in 1902 was social suicide. For over 85 years, the world had no idea this child existed. It wasn't until 1987, when a cache of love letters between Einstein and Mileva was discovered, that historians learned about Lieserl. The letters reveal Einstein's excitement about becoming a father. Writing to Mileva, "How happy I am to have our little daughter. I will love her so much when I can hold her in my arms." But Einstein never got that chance. Lieserl remained in Serbia with Mileva's parents, while Einstein struggled to find stable work that could support a family. The few references to her in their letters are heartbreaking and mysterious. In September 1903, Einstein wrote to Mileva asking, "What happened to Lisa? Is she registered? We must take good care that no one knows about her." This is the last mention of Lieserl in any known correspondence. She simply vanishes from history. What happened to Einstein's secret daughter? Historians have 3 main theories. Some believe Lieserl died from scarlet fever in 1903. This would explain Einstein's sudden silence about her and why there are no further records. Others think Mileva's parents arranged a secret adoption. In rural Serbia, it wasn't uncommon for unmarried mothers to give children to childless couples, with the birth parents pretending the child had died. The most intriguing theory suggests Lieserl lived, but was given a completely new identity. Some researchers believe they've identified women in Serbia who could be Lieserl, but DNA testing has never definitively proven any connection. What we do know is that this secret haunted Einstein. Despite becoming one of history's most documented figures, he never spoke publicly about Lieserl. When he married Mileva in 1903, they agreed to bury this chapter of their lives forever. For Mileva, the cost was enormous. She had been a brilliant physics student with dreams of her own scientific career. But the scandal of an illegitimate child, combined with the social expectations of the time, effectively ended her academic ambitions. She would spend the rest of her life in Einstein's shadow, raising his children while he changed the world. Lieserl Einstein remains one of history's great mysteries. The vanished daughter of a man who unlocked the secrets of the universe but couldn't protect his own child from disappearing into the void of history. Einstein's story as a father was just beginning, and his next 2 children would face entirely different challenges. Hans Albert Einstein. In 1904, Einstein and Mileva welcomed their second child, Hans Albert Einstein. Unlike his mysterious sister Lieserl, Hans Albert would live his entire life in the spotlight of being Einstein's son, and the pressure would shape every decision he made. Hans Albert grew up during his father's most revolutionary period. While little Hans was learning to walk and talk, his father was developing the theory of relativity and becoming internationally famous. Imagine having bedtime stories about the speed of light and curved space-time. But Einstein, despite his gentle public image, was often an absent and demanding father. He was consumed by his work, traveling constantly for lectures and conferences. When he was home, he expected intellectual conversations even with his young son. In 1919, when Hans Albert was 15, his parents' troubled marriage finally collapsed. Einstein divorced Mileva and immediately married his cousin Elsa. For Hans Albert, this wasn't just losing his family, it was being torn between loyalty to his mother and his father's growing fame. Einstein had clear expectations. His sons should become scientists, preferably physicists. But Hans Albert had different dreams. He was fascinated by engineering, particularly hydraulic engineering and river systems. To Einstein, this was like choosing to be a plumber instead of a poet. Despite his father's disapproval, Hans Albert pursued engineering at ETH Zurich. Ironically, the same institution where Einstein and Mileva had met, the young man was brilliant in his own right, but constantly lived in his father's shadow. Professors and classmates couldn't see him as just Hans Albert. He was always Einstein's son. Hans Albert proved his worth, becoming a world-renowned expert in sediment transport, the study of how rivers carry particles like sand and silt. His work was crucial for dam construction, flood control, and river management. But while his father bent the laws of physics, Hans Albert was seen as dealing with mere applied science. In 1938, as Nazi Germany threatened Europe, Hans Albert made a crucial decision. He moved to the United States, eventually becoming a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. Here, away from the immediate shadow of his father's European fame, he could finally establish his own identity. The relationship between Albert and Hans Albert was complex. Einstein respected his son's intelligence, but never fully understood his career choice. In letters, Einstein would write about physics breakthroughs, while Hans Albert would respond with updates about water flow dynamics and hydraulic structures. During World War II, while Einstein was advocating for nuclear research in America, Hans Albert was working on practical engineering problems for the war effort. Both father and son were contributing to the Allied cause, but in completely different ways. Hans Albert faced his own personal tragedies. His first marriage ended in divorce, and he struggled with the constant comparisons to his father. He was a successful scientist in his own right, but the world always wanted to know, are you as smart as your father? In his later years, Hans Albert found peace in his work and his second marriage. He became a respected figure in hydraulic engineering, publishing important research and mentoring the next generation of engineers. But he never escaped the burden of his last name. Hans Albert Einstein died in 1973 at age 69. Having lived a full life dedicated to understanding water the way his father understood space and time, his obituaries inevitably mentioned his famous father, but also recognized his own significant contributions to science and engineering. Hans Albert's story is one of a brilliant man who chose his own path, despite enormous pressure to follow in his father's footsteps. He proved that genius can take many forms, and that sometimes the most rebellious act is simply being yourself. But if Hans Albert's story was one of eventual success and acceptance, his younger brother's fate would be far more tragic. Edward Einstein. Einstein's youngest son, Edward, was born in 1910, and his story is perhaps the most heartbreaking chapter in the Einstein family saga. While his father was unlocking the mysteries of the universe, Edward would become lost in the mysteries of his own mind. As a child, Edward, nicknamed Tet, showed incredible promise. He was artistic, sensitive, and intellectually gifted. While his older brother Hans Albert was drawn to practical engineering, Edward was fascinated by literature, philosophy, and music. He could play piano beautifully and had a poet's soul. Einstein adored Edward and saw in him a potential successor in theoretical physics. Unlike with Hans Albert, Einstein encouraged Edward's intellectual pursuits. They would have deep, philosophical discussions, and Einstein would share his latest scientific insights with his youngest son. But by his teenage years, something was clearly wrong with Edward. He began experiencing severe mood swings, periods of deep depression followed by manic episodes. He would stay awake for days, writing feverishly, then crash into weeks of barely being able to get out of bed in 1930. When Edward was 20 years old and studying medicine at the University of Zurich, he suffered a complete mental breakdown. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, a condition that, in the 1930s, was barely understood and effectively untreatable. For Einstein, this was devastating on multiple levels. Not only was his beloved son suffering, but mental illness carried enormous social stigma. Einstein, who was becoming an international celebrity, was terrified that Eduard's condition would become public knowledge and damage his reputation. Einstein and Mileva made the painful decision to keep Eduard's illness secret from the world. They told people he was unwell or studying privately. The brilliant young man who had once discussed philosophy with his father was quietly hidden away. The burden of caring for Eduard fell primarily on Mileva. While Einstein traveled the world giving lectures and receiving accolades, she remained in Zurich, caring for their increasingly unstable son. The stress destroyed her health and consumed her life. The family tried every treatment available in the 1930s, none of them effective by today's standards. Eduard underwent various forms of therapy, was given experimental drugs, and even endured electroshock treatment. Nothing helped, and some treatments likely made him worse. In 1933, Einstein left Europe forever, immigrating to America as the Nazis rose to power. He would never see Eduard again. Their last meeting was awkward and painful. Eduard was heavily medicated and barely recognized his father. By 1932, Eduard's condition had deteriorated to the point where he needed constant care. He was institutionalized at the Berg-Holzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, the same institution where Carl Jung had once worked. He would spend the rest of his life there. Einstein was haunted by guilt over Eduard. He continued to pay for his son's care and wrote letters, but he never returned to visit. Some biographers suggest Einstein couldn't bear to see what his son had become. Others believe he was afraid the stress of his fame had contributed to Eduard's breakdown. What makes Eduard's story so tragic is the glimpse of what he might have been. His early writings showed genuine literary talent. His musical abilities were exceptional. Had he been born in an era with better understanding and treatment of mental illness, he might have made his own mark on the world. Eduard spent over 40 years in psychiatric care. He had some better periods where he could read, write letters, and even compose music. But these moments of clarity became increasingly rare as the decades passed. When Einstein died in 1955, Eduard was informed of his father's death, but showed little reaction. By then, his illness had progressed to the point where he lived mostly in his own internal world. Eduard Einstein died in 1965 at age 55, having spent more than half his life in psychiatric care. His death was barely noted in the press. The world's attention was focused on his father's scientific legacy, not the tragic son who had been forgotten. Eduard's story reveals the darker side of genius and fame. While Einstein was celebrated as one of humanity's greatest minds, his own son was suffering from a condition that was poorly understood and heavily stigmatized. The family's decision to hide Eduard's illness was understandable for its time, but it meant he became a forgotten chapter in the Einstein story. Today, we understand that schizophrenia is a complex brain disorder with both genetic and environmental factors. There's no evidence that Einstein's genius or his parenting caused Eduard's illness, but the secrecy and shame surrounding it certainly made it worse. Eduard Einstein represents all the brilliant minds that have been lost to mental illness throughout history, potential that was never realized because the tools and understanding weren't available to help so. What happened to Albert Einstein's 3 children? Einstein remains history's ghost, a daughter who may have lived for months or decades, but who disappeared from the record entirely. Her story shows how social conventions of the early 1900s could erase a person from existence. In 2019, Serbian researchers claim to have found evidence that Lieserl lived until 1993 under an assumed name, but the proof remains inconclusive. What we do know is that Einstein carried the guilt of this secret daughter his entire life. In his later years, he would speak about the importance of social justice and human rights, perhaps influenced by his early experience of how society could condemn an innocent child. Hans Albert Einstein achieved what his siblings could not, a successful life on his own terms. He became a distinguished professor, made important contributions to hydraulic engineering, and raised a family of his own. His children, Einstein's grandchildren, have largely stayed out of the public eye, living normal lives without the burden of genius expectations. Hans Albert's legacy is proof that brilliance comes in many forms. While he never discovered the secrets of relativity, his work helped control floods, build better dams, and understand river systems. In its own way, his practical genius has saved more lives than his father's theoretical breakthroughs. Edward Einstein's story is perhaps the most important for modern audiences. His battle with mental illness shows how far we've come in understanding and treating psychiatric conditions, but also how much further we need to go. Today, someone with Edward's symptoms would have access to medications, therapies, and support systems that simply didn't exist in the 1930s. His tragedy reminds us that behind every family touched by mental illness, there are stories of lost potential and heartbreak. In his later years, Einstein reflected on his failures as a father. He once wrote, "I made one great mistake in my life. When I signed the letter to President Roosevelt recommending that atom bombs be made, but there was some justification the danger that the Germans would make them. But privately, friends said his greater regret was his children, the daughter he never knew, the son he never understood, and the son he couldn't save." The Einstein children's stories offer lessons that resonate today. Lieserl's disappearance reminds us how social stigma can destroy lives and erase history. In our age of social media and permanent digital records, we must be careful not to create new forms of erasure. Hans Albert's success, despite family pressure, shows the importance of following your own path, even when everyone expects you to be someone else. Edward's tragedy highlights the ongoing need for mental health awareness, research, and compassion. Albert Einstein changed how we understand the universe, but he couldn't solve the mysteries closest to home. His children's lives remind us that genius doesn't protect families from human struggles, loss, mental illness, family conflict, and the search for identity. The next time you see that famous photo of Einstein with his wild hair and thoughtful expression, remember, he wasn't just the world's greatest physicist. He was also a father who loved his children, made mistakes, carried secrets, and lived with regrets. His children's stories are part of his legacy too, not the part carved in marble or written in textbooks, but the part that reminds us that even geniuses are human. The Einstein children lived in the shadow of history's greatest mind, each finding their own path through darkness and light. Their stories deserve to be remembered not just as footnotes to their father's genius, but as human tales of love, loss, and the complex legacy of fame. If you found these hidden stories as fascinating as we did, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with others who love learning about the human side of history. Subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the untold stories behind famous figures. And remember, behind every great person in history, there's a family with their own struggles, triumphs, and secrets. Sometimes those stories are just as important as the ones that made it into the history books. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.